Good afternoon. Welcome to the Economic Club of Florida's 586th meeting in our continued series of distinguished speakers. My name is Chris Emanuel, and I have the pleasure of serving as the club president, and I hereby call this meeting to order. Please silence your cell phones or any other device that vibrates or rings to stun. Our program is being live streamed. And with that, please everyone stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Today we are honored to have Robert Kaplan as our speaker. He serves as president as CEO. Pardon me, just a second. He served as president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas from 2015 to 2021, and is a longtime Goldman Sachs executive, where he currently serves as vice chairman. Prior to joining the Dallas Fed, Mr. Kaplan was a faculty member and senior associate dean at Harvard Business School. He will be more formally introduced in just a moment. We are currently in the process of finalizing our speakers for the remainder of the year. We're very excited. Registration for our March and February programs will be on the website shortly. We look forward to seeing you then. Please visit our website for more information. One of the things that makes this club run is the sponsors that we have, not only your membership dues, but corporations throughout the community that have invested their time and resources in us. We have sponsorship opportunities if any of your businesses or any of your friends' businesses would like to join us and help continue these conversations throughout the Tallahassee community. If you have an interest in that, please see me or any other board member. Now, I would like to recognize our trustee members. These are individuals that make additional contributions to the club and are able to come to some events from time to time. We thank them. Please stand. As is tradition for the club, we're going to go around the room and introduce our guests of the organization. Do we have any guests at this table over here?
Yeah, this is my neighbor, David Lemus. David has a consulting firm and he works with businesses all across the company or the country and the world. I heard him and his wife from Tallahassee when they left Portland. There's a tiny town in the Tibetan Hills that they took a great neighborhood and a great city. So please do not if he becomes a member of the club.
This table here.
I was my guest, Shannon Weiler with Captain City Trust Company.
This table here. Any in the back.
I'd like to introduce you to Ashley Betts. Ashley is a senior at the University of Florida studying economics. And she is currently in Tallahassee, and she's an intern to our president at the University of Florida here in town. Ashley Betts.
My guest today is Anthony Bartlett with the Florida Bank of Sachs.
And then white over there, recruiting services that has been going for years now, right? That have a part of the community.
Wanda Bennett, she is with the Florida Head Start Association, and I've met her through Reset, so thank you, Linda.
Dominic?
Yes, we've got Jessica Little. She's a research analyst at Florida Tax Work.
So here today, Tom McClellan, Bill Party Advisor, and relevant to stand grandfather's footsteps.
I guess the name is Tom Bianco. He's the owner of Premier Voters. So people want to buy cars to me.
Last guest.
Retired director of Florida, and former secretary of the Florida Senate.
If you join me in giving all of our guests a quick round of applause. It occurs to me that the legislature has canceled all their committee meetings. The governor has declared a state of emergency. Florida State University has shut down classes, and we appreciate y'all coming here and certainly our guests coming here. With that, I'd like to introduce our head table. First, starting with my left, your right, is Valerie Wickbolt. She's the president of Avail Strategies and was recently elected to serve on the board of directors. Avail Strategies is a government and consulting lobbying firm that's dedicated to improving the workings of government for the overall benefit of the general public. Next, we're joined by Bill Moore. He's the market president for Synovos. He's a graduate of the University of Miami and of the University of Florida, and is active in numerous organizations, including the Economic Club of Florida. To my far right, your far left, is Lamar Taylor. He's the Chief Investment Officer for the state of Florida, the State Board of Administration. I'm particularly thankful for him because he manages both my retirement and my mother-in-law's retirement. And John Bradley, who works also at the SBA. He oversees a complicated portfolio of investments, including the venture arm of the state pension fund, which I think is at $25 to $26 billion, depending on what the market has done this morning. With that, I'd like to invite John Bradley up to formally introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Chris, and it's great to be here with everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Rob Kaplan. Rob is Vice Chairman of Goldman Sachs and a member of the Management Committee. Previously, Rob served as President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. Before joining the Fed, Rob was the Martin Marshall Professor of Management Practice and Senior Associate Dean at Harvard Business School. Rob initially joined Goldman Sachs in 1983 and became a partner in 1990. In 2002, he became Vice Chairman of the firm with global responsibility for the investment banking and investment management divisions. He also served as co-chair of the Partnership Committee and chair of the Goldman Sachs Pine Street Leadership Program. In 1998, Rob became global co-head of investment banking and a member of the Management Committee. His previous roles included serving as head of Asia Pacific Investment Banking, co-chief operating officer of Global Investment Banking, and head of the Americas Corporate Finance Department. Rob retired from the firm in 2006 to join Harvard Business School, becoming a senior director at that time. Rob is chairman of Project ALS and co-chairman of the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation. He's a board member of Harvard Medical School and St. Mark's School of Texas, and is a member of the George W. Bush Institute's Advisory Council. Rob is also an advisory board member of the Baker Institute. He serves on the Bipartisan Policy Center President's Council and on the board of directors at the Holdsworth Center. Rob is the author of 3 books on leadership: What You Really Need to Lead, What You're Really Meant to Do, and What to Ask the Person in the Mirror. Rob earned a Bachelor of Science from the University of Kansas and an MBA from Harvard Business School. And so with that, I will now turn it over to today's guest speaker, Rob Kaplan.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here. And I'll make sure to avoid the glare if I can. Thank you all for being here. I know there's a lot of worries about the weather, and so I'm really impressed that everybody made it out. What I'm going to do is probably talk for not more than 20 minutes or so, and I want to take the rest of the time to answer your questions. So we can go deep on a lot of things, but let me give you a thumbnail overview as to what I think is going on in the U.S. economy and where I think we're likely to go in this next year and what you should watch for. And I will not use slides. I'm just going to talk to you. All right. And so if I had to characterize the economy that I guess the phase of the economy that's just ending, literally just ended officially yesterday, I would characterize this economy with 3 main things. One, the economy over the last 4 years, whether we like it or not, has been government spending led. Okay. If you go back to 2019, net debt of the U.S. government divided by GDP was about in the mid 70s, say 75%. Today, we're pushing up near 100% debt to GDP. So what happened? Well, the big thing that happened is COVID happened. However, that wasn't all of the story. So in 2020, I don't need to recount COVID, because remember, GDP growth dropped 30+% in March, rebounded 30+% in April, and we spent the rest of 2020 digging out of the COVID economy. The GDP gap that we estimated, and I was at the Fed at the time, the gap in GDP we thought would be lost from COVID was in the neighborhood of $2 trillion. About a $23 trillion economy in 2020. We thought GDP was going to be down about 8%, round it up a little bit, you get to $2 trillion. And the fiscal authorities passed a bill to fill that gap. That was called the CARES Act. Remember the CARES Act? Seems like eons ago, but it was just in 2020. That literally filled the COVID GDP gap. In addition, at the Fed, we lowered the Fed funds rate to 0. And we started buying 80 billion of treasuries and 40 billion of mortgage-backed securities every month, which is a nice way of saying we printed every dollar of the CARES Act. Now, what was unique about 2020? It's the first recession in modern history that I'm aware of where GDP went down and consumer spending actually went up. Okay, didn't go up on services because we couldn't do services, but we could buy goods. Goods spending really ramped up, and so the CARES Act really did protect citizens, not perfectly, but protected citizens and allowed us to get through 2020. I would argue that if the excess fiscal spending stopped right there, I don't think we would have had the extent of the inflation issues that we've ultimately had. And let me explain why. Okay, now we start 2021. We've already filled the COVID gap. You remember we had a vaccine in early 21. The economy is starting to recover. You have a new administration, and we passed another piece of very substantial legislation called the American Rescue Act, ARPA. That ring a bell? That was passed in 2021. It went through the budget in 2021. So just to give you a sense, in 2019, we ran a budget deficit in the United States around 4% of GDP. In 2020, we ran a budget deficit around 15% of GDP, historically high, okay? What people don't focus on is in 21, we ran another monster deficit around 12 or 13% of GDP. Historic, was not to fill the COVID gap. The American Rescue Act money got spent in 21, 22, 23, and 24. The money got done being obligated by the end of 24, has to be finally spent by 25. So what do I mean by that? We had a very substantial fiscal boost that went through the 21 budget deficits. We stopped watching in 22, 23, and 24, but it was there, and it made GDP growth higher than it would have otherwise been. Not done yet. We then also passed the Inflation Reduction Act, another $1 trillion. Okay, that fostered a whole range of public-private partnerships all through the United States. So what's an example? You may have seen these. There are 23 or 24 lithium battery plants being built in cities and states all through the US. I'm from Kansas. In Kansas, we announced the largest infrastructure project in the history of the state in 2023, a $4 billion lithium battery plant, something like 5,000 construction workers, 15,000 plant workers in a state that had an unemployment rate of 2.9%. Okay, so it's a big project. These are being spread all through the United States, 25% of the money being government, 75% being private, but the project wouldn't happen without the government money. So Inflation Reduction Act, which still hasn't been fully spent yet, is fostering this kind of spending, very stimulative to these local communities. In Kansas, when you announce a project like that, and I'm there a lot because I'm an alumni at University of Kansas, every restaurant in the state tells me they can't find workers. Every service sector establishment just lost workers because they're going to make $37.50 an hour at the lithium battery plant in DeSoto, Kansas. This is going on all through the country. Not done yet. One more. The Infrastructure Act, bipartisan, by the way, another $1 trillion, which is spending around the US on very large infrastructure projects. For example, in New York, there's a tunnel project that's going to be, I'm rounding, $50 billion, take 60,000 workers. And so that's $6 trillion of extraordinary spending authorizations. And the original COVID gap was $2 trillion. So what's the effect of all this? I would argue that GDP growth in the last 3 or 4 years has been higher than it would have been otherwise because of all this fiscal spending. In addition, and I can say this, I was at the Fed probably should have stopped buying bonds. The 80 billion of treasuries and 40 billion of mortgage-backed securities probably should have started winding it down in 2021, but didn't start winding it down until sometime in the middle of 2022, did not start raising rates. And so this would be, you got your foot on the pedal on fiscal, you've got your foot on the pedal on monetary, and we did that, I would argue, for an extended period of time. The net effect of this was inflation got away from us. You may remember in 2021, it was running at 9%. It was running not that high in 22. It's sort of been decelerating down. But to a worker, there's no victory parties going on right now that inflation is down to, say, 2.5%, 2.75%, because they've lost 20 to 25% purchasing power. All right. And the lower the rate, that's great, but workers care about not the rate right now, it's the cumulative price impact. There are 2 groups of consumers in the US, which I think help explain this. There are 65 to 70 million workers in this country that make $55,000 a year or less. They work in a lot of sectors. They tend not to have a college education, tend to be high school graduate. And I can tell you, this loss of purchasing power that we had in 21, 22, 23, and 24 has meant they can't make ends meet today. So $55,000 a year may sound like a lot. That's $25 plus an hour, cannot make ends meet. Have to often work a second job in at-risk areas, and I see this in Texas where I live. Kids are dropping out disproportionately out of at-risk high schools. Where are they going? To help their families make ends meet. They're going to work before they graduate. So this group, by the way, I don't need to get into politics of it, voted in a manner in the recent election that was uncharacteristic for them. It was, for a lot of them, I believe it was economic, because they're frustrated that they are struggling to make ends meet. There's, by the way, a second group of consumers, if it makes you feel better, and many of us are in that group, who another 65 to 70 million who are 55 and older, own their home, have a fixed rate mortgage, have financial assets, and this period's been pretty good. And those folks are spending in a good mood. Yes, there's inflation for them, but their earnings growth has far outstripped it. They have been insulated from interest rate increases because their mortgage is fixed. And both groups of consumers are spending. This group is watching every dollar, goes into McDonald's and is even trading down when they go into McDonald's. This group is spending more liberally. And I think that's why you see some of the mixed consumer reports and a lot of the dissatisfaction that you're seeing with the economy, where you say, aren't they reading the paper? Things are great. Not so great, because the cumulative price increase. Okay, so when I say government spending led, one last comment, then we'll move on. The other aspect is we just ran this last year close to a $2 trillion deficit. as a percentage of GDP, the $2 trillion deficit. That is about 6.5% of GDP. And we kind of on the news, they kind of yawn it off. That is a historically high deficit when you're at full employment. We tend to run high deficits when unemployment is up. We don't tend to run deficits this high when we're at full employment. The economy is good. We're in the good part of the cycle. We're going to run another $2 trillion this year. That's in addition to the ARPA money I just talked about that already ran through the 21 budget and all these significant spending programs. So what's the punchline on that? And then I'm going to speed along here. Is I would argue if GDP growth this last year was 2.75% real GDP growth, I would argue some portion of that I think is artificially high because of this government spending. Why does it matter? And we were talking at the table, the low grade fever on why it matters is, I think, look at the 10-year treasury, look at the 30-year treasury. What we're seeing, even as the Fed has been cutting rates, the back end of the treasury curve is going up. Didn't they get the message that the Fed's cutting rates? Well, why is this happening? I'll tell you why it's happening. We sold last year 10 trillion of treasuries. People around the world and here are more reluctant to buy duration. Banks used to buy duration. I don't need to tell you, Silicon Valley Bank, First Republic, it didn't go very well. They're very hesitant. The Fed is running off its balance sheet. We used to buy duration. Foreigners bought more duration. And my point is, I think the reason many big bond buyers have said they're being reluctant to buy the 10-year, and they'll buy a 5-year treasury. People want to be in the dollar, by the way. They want to be in U.S. financial assets. They just are a little bit nervous until we show more fiscal discipline about buying the 10-year and longer. And the cost of it is you see the cost 10-year treasury and 30-year are inching up. Mortgage rates are based on that long end of the curve. And so I'm going to get to where we're going in a moment, but we're coming out of a period where, yes, we didn't have a downturn. We had a soft landing, but we bought it, I would argue, and we paid full price for it. And the cost of that, I think we're seeing a little bit of a hangover. And so we have to be prepared. Where we're going to go now is we're going to try through Doge, so-called Doge, and I think there's going to be an effort to get these deficits as a percentage of GDP lower. What you have to understand is that may mean organic growth in the United States may ultimately be higher, but top line, some of the excess growth is going to come down. China's going through this right now. They grew 6.5% every year, but because they leveraged up every year, and they're now can't keep doing it, and you see their growth is now trending lower. We're not going to go through as badly as they do, but we've got that issue. So the other comment I would make is the reason this leverage is, that last comment, why it's a big deal, it's worth spending this amount of time on it, is one of the big structural factors of the US is labor force growth is decelerating, okay, before immigration. Because of aging, when I was growing up, and in the 70s and 80s, labor force growth in this country was 2.5%, 3%. GDP growth is growth in the labor force plus growth in productivity. And when you've got a baby boom generation growing up into the economy, it means you got a pretty good tailwind for GDP growth. Labor force growth right now before immigration in this country is around 0 because of aging. 0 to 0.25%. Don't feel so bad. China's got it worse. Germany is actually shrinking. Japan is shrinking. You know, demographics are a big problem in the world, but the issue is it's not a great combination to be aging and leveraging up. It would be like you in the audience saying, I'm going to tell my kids, great news. I'm getting older, but we're going to borrow more money and leverage. You don't do that. It's as you get older, you want to deleverage. And we've just come through a 4-year period where we've kind of done the opposite, and we're going to have to deal with it now. Does that make sense? Okay, 2 other quick things. We much more highly regulated economy from between 20 and 24. I think regulation's necessary, but in a world that's aging, where we're highly leveraged, productivity growth is key. And I would guess, you're going to see a real push by the new administration to review regulation in every industry with the purpose of trying to improve productivity growth. That makes sense? Third thing that we've seen, which has helped the economy, is labor force surges from immigration. So I don't need to tell you, I won't get into all the controversy around the border and people coming in. Some fraction of the people coming in across the border over the last 3 or 4 years have entered the workforce. So I mentioned GDP growth is growth in the workforce plus growth in productivity. We've had these labor force surges because some of the immigrants have entered the workforce. That's actually helped GDP growth. It's helped rebalance the workforce. It's helped the Fed get more sanguine about supply demand of workers. But I don't need to tell you, at the risk of stating the obvious, that phase is going to end, and that we're going about this. We are now officially sealing the border. We're going to start deporting certain groups of workers. And the question is going to be what's going to happen with labor force growth. That's literally the economy we're coming out of. Okay, so let me just talk about where we're heading, and I've already hit on a few points. So then just to summarize, you're going to see a regulatory review economy-wide. Not that we won't have tough regulation, but I think the purpose will be to try to improve productivity growth. In an aging society where we need to deleverage, we're going to try to improve productivity through some regulatory relief. That's number one. Number two, on labor force, I just mentioned, seal the border, stop these labor force surges. The only issue will be we need labor force growth in the United States. I just told you we're aging and workforce growth is down to about 0.25%. We're going to have to find ways to grow the workforce. So what I'm waiting to, and listening for in these pronouncements, I get what we're going to do for criminals, et cetera. How far will they go with the deportations? And then second, are we going to ramp up legal immigration in the more appropriate way? Because we need workforce growth. In the first 4 years of the Trump administration, people may forget, we had 1 to 2 million workforce growth every year. Pretty healthy. The issue and the risk is if we go too far with the deportations, including deporting people who are not criminals but in the workforce, or we induce some of them to leave with their families and we don't have legal immigration, it will slow growth. So that's a big thing to watch. I've already talked about there's going to be a real effort, and it wasn't hit on yesterday other than mentioned, but it's coming. There's going to be a real effort to try to bend these deficits from, say, 6.5%, 7% of GDP down to, you don't need to get down to 3 or 4, but you need to show we're heading in the right direction. And I think what we're going to find, it's going to be very painful and challenging. It will take the executive branch, it will take Congress to try to bend the curve, but a lot of money that is spent by the US government on things that we've kind of gotten used to. I just gave a talk this morning on Alzheimer's and brain health, and I told the group we're not going to get as much money from the National Institute of Health. We should accept it. Just we don't have the money at the government level. Private philanthropists will have to step in. But I think you should expect we're going to see lower government spending. The Inflation Reduction Act and Infrastructure Act, my guess is those are going to be slowed down or repurposed in order to try to get this debt situation under control. And the hope is if we show some fiscal discipline, maybe people will be more willing again to buy the 10-year and 30-year treasury, and you'll start, stop seeing the term premium inch up. We'll talk about this. 2 other things, tariffs. So the tariffs is I was at the Fed for 2017 to 2020, and we did an enormous analysis on tariffs. Texas is the largest exporting state in the country. And I don't think it's clear yet what this administration is going to do on tariffs. And here's why I don't think it's clear. Are you going to use tariffs as a negotiating lever? Are you going to use it because you think it generates tax revenue? Are you going to use it because you want to induce more manufacturing here rather than importing? And the truth is, I don't know yet which I've heard different, and here's why I'm still confused. If you're going to have a trade dispute with China and encourage companies here to locate more manufacturing instead in the United States, most CEOs I talk to and that you would hear from in the US domicile manufacturing here because they can source intermediate goods for their plant from Mexico. In other words, 40% of imports from Mexico are intermediate goods. They're not finished goods. They have that relationship, supply chain and logistical relationship, have allowed US companies to build manufacturing here. If we want to encourage more manufacturing here, if you put tariffs on China and Mexico and Canada, I'm really not sure, and most CEOs I talk to are not sure yet what they're going to do because they are nervous about locating a plant here that's 100% US because it's too expensive. It's not going to be globally competitive. Okay. And so what I would hope we'll see is more differentiation, maybe tariffs, negotiation with certain countries, but I'll be interested to see whether we keep the corridor open between Mexico and Canada, because I think having a North American strategy, if you're going to go down this tariff road, a North American strategy, I think, will serve us well. And the threat, I can't tell whether that's where we're going. Does that make sense? There's one other big subject that I think you're going to see a very large change on, and that's energy policy. It was already mentioned yesterday. So why is that? So we are going through the biggest structural change, I would argue, that I look at in the US and global economy is the transition away from fossil fuels to wind, solar alternatives, cleaner. We've got to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I think globally, I think not universally, but globally, there's a recognition of that. However, here's the problem. As we limit fossil fuel production, we don't have enough wind and solar. We haven't perfected battery storage. We're not using nuclear. There's a gap. We don't produce enough. We may be 2 or 3 years away from peak oil demand. Okay. I think this administration is going to say, at a minimum, while we're going through this transition, I think some people may worry they're going to turn back the clock on the transition, but at a minimum, I think they're going to say, if you're going to do this transition, let's produce more fossil fuels. It's better than burning coal, which we're doing right now, too much around the world. We're the cleanest producer in the world in the United States. Let's produce more. Let's allow pipelines. Let's make permitting easier. Let's make it easier to run a refinery. Let's improve the whole US ecosystem. And I think it'll make it'll ensure that we don't do this transition on the backs of low, moderate income families. This first group that can't make ends meet often drives a car to get to work. They're going to try to reduce the price with the hope that that's one factor in reducing inflation. So you're going to see a whole review of the entire energy ecosystem. And it'll be controversial because they may also want to reduce subsidies and other things for alternatives. But I still believe we're going to speed along a prototype for nuclear and others to improve the grid and the power grid. So if this works, and I'm going to stop here, if this works, we're going to go from a more government-driven, more highly regulated economy to one ideally that's more organically driven, i.e. private sector driven, less regulated, more productivity growth, more inducements for productivity growth, and ideally the thought is more sustainable because it's private sector driven. And ideally, we'll find a way to bend the curve on the deficit. Whether we'll get from here to there, I don't know, but I think that's the intention. And we can talk a lot about the impact on markets and all that, but that's sort of the thumbnail overview, I think, of where we've been and where we're going, if that makes sense. All right, let's go to your questions. We can go a lot deeper on a lot of things. Yes, go ahead.
Hey, great, thanks. Really appreciate the information, very, very informative. I'm curious in regards to regulations and rolling back some of that, particularly in the financial services. Dodd-Frank was such a huge overreach. You've got so much capital on the sidelines. You know, the CFPB is really overstepping their bounds.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Yes, you are going to, if you're going to, the theory is the following. And by the way, every industry I talk to has got a regulatory story about how they feel excessively burdened by regulation that's undermining their productivity. In the financial sector, if the narrative I gave makes sense, meaning less government spending footprint, but the private sector is going to have to step in. Sorry. Yeah, you go ahead. Now, let me finish. You need the banks to step up and do more lending. So I think there's going to be an effort to empower the banks to be more active. My guess is private credit will also be more active. You're going to see the private sector do more. And I think the thought is regulatory relief will empower them to do it. It's not that there won't be tough regulation, but maybe the pendulum is, oops, today's swung too far, just like I did just there. It's a good example. Pendulum has swung too far, and we need tough regulation, but you need bankers to be playing a more active role in their communities and in lending, private sector doing more as the government footprint steps back. That's the thought. Yes, fire away.
Thank you very much for being here today and sharing with us in a way that everybody can understand exactly where we are at the federal level and what we've been doing and what's been going on. It's very refreshing, especially given everything we get out of the meeting. So I work with these two guys to the right, and I do debt for the state, but we have an entirely different way to approach it. So you were for over the last 5 years, the deficit or the debt, the aggregate amount of debt is increased $8 trillion. $8 trillion. It's a 33% increase.
Right.
5 years.
Right.
State of Florida has reduced our debt.
Right.
Over the same period of time, about 45%.
Right. Texas also.
In Florida, our debt per capita, $650 for every man.
Right.
At the federal level, $116,000 for every man.
So I can talk about why some states have been able to do that, and let's get to that. Mhm.
You do debt per taxpayer, it's $220,000. So we've got profligate spending under both Republican administrations and Democratic administrations.
Right.
So we would not be good for each other. We'd be in an echo chamber because everything that you said resonates with me in terms of things that I care about and things that are not talked about in a way that has any sort of meaningful resonance with people. So I'm curious what you think is going to be the catalyst for controlling the profligate spending at the federal level.
Okay.
And is it sustainable? Is this $2 trillion annual deficit sustainable? Because if you do the math, it's pretty simple. It means 35 cents of every federal dollar that's spent is borrowed money that has to get paid back by someone at some point in time. Well, who is that? That's me and you, right? So I go, oh my gosh, what are we doing? And when are we going to stop? What's going to change this? What's going to change the behavior in Washington, D.C. to allow that to occur? And the last thing I'll say is
Let me make you a deal. I'll make you a deal. I'm gonna help you out by jumping in here. Is that okay? Okay. So let me back up. I live in Texas. I'm from Kansas. One of the big challenges we face in the United States, I mentioned, is when I was growing up, workforce growth and population growth, because of the baby boom, as I said, in the 70s and 80s, when Paul Volcker was famously raising rates, workforce growth was almost 3%. So, I mean, he could be tough and he could grind the economy down, but we knew we were going to come back because we had a structural tailwind, which was workforce growth. Today, as I said, because of aging, we're down approaching 0 to 0.25%. However, there are 4 or 5 states in this country that are bucking that trend. Texas is one of them. Florida is one of them. And what do I mean by bucking the trend? People are moving, as you guys know, from all over the country to Florida. So workforce growth in Florida has been actually very, very good. In Texas, very, very good. In Kansas, like that. And so one of the things I notice around the country is only as long as workforce growth nationwide is going to be sluggish, you're going to have 4 or 5 or 6 states. Florida is going to be one of them. We're going to outperform everyone. We'll be able to have plenty of revenue. We'll be able to manage their budgets. We'll have spending on education. We'll have all the money they need to do things. You take away that workforce growth, it gets much tougher. And then you get Illinois, Connecticut, and a whole bunch of other states. So that's a long-winded way of saying to deleverage at the government level, I would argue it's going to be a puzzle. We've got to cut and be more responsible fiscally, but cutting alone probably isn't going to get us there. We also have to grow faster. 2 big ways to grow faster. Improve productivity growth. That's why I think the regulatory review makes a lot of sense so that we can unleash business to have more productivity. Probably have to improve early childhood literacy and education. So I spent enough time with the head of Dade County Junior College. You've got a fabulous workforce training machine down here, for example. We've got to get better at that all through the United States. But the other big thing, and it's a super sensitive topic, if we want to deleverage, we're going to probably have to find ways to grow the workforce. Florida's got it. Texas has got it. Handful of other states have it. I think the nation ultimately, but I mean, it needs to be legal. It needs to be probably more like Canada's, where it's skill-based and employer-based. But I think one of the things we're struggling with, we're spending, you could argue we overspend. We probably don't have as much productivity improvement as we need. Our education system has now lagged elsewhere in the world, which is limited productivity. And we need more workforce growth, which means we need a real discussion, sensitive, controversial, about legal immigration. And so that's the challenge. Cutting alone won't do it. And so that's why these pro-growth policies, as well as fiscal discipline, that combination, it's hard to do. And no one of these actions will solve it. It'll take all 10, like a jigsaw puzzle. And that's what I hope we're about to embark on. But again, workforce growth is a piece of this puzzle I'm still listening for. The deportation, seal the border, great. But you need a further step. We got to grow the workforce too. And so we'll see how that goes. And I want to give somebody else a chance here. I apologize. So can we come back after we get to other folks?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I will come back, I promise.
Thank you, Rob. Don McLeod for that question. I agree that a big part of the problem is government spending, not alone, but just yet grow the economy. Oftentimes, it's will grow the economy because they don't control spending. Okay. And the biggest area, of course, there shows little interest in controlling, let alone reducing entitlement.
Right.
Okay, so where do you think we find some meaningful government spending reductions in addition to, regulatory controls and things?
So this is one's great question. So there's been a lot of discussion since DOGE was announced. Everybody, including me, has pulled out the list of the number of employees by government department. You go, my God, I thought there were more employees. And you start, and people are realizing if you just terminate government employees, that doesn't save enough money. And I think people are also realizing, and it's again a very sensitive topic, if you don't touch entitlements and you say you won't either means test or raise the retirement age, which is a very controversial subject, somehow restructure these entitlements, it's hard to save the amount of money that you want to save. So far, the new administration, I think, has indicated They don't want to touch entitlements. And I would say me, along with you, I'm watching just to see if they're going to really save. I know Elon Musk has said first 2 trillion. Now he said maybe 1 trillion. I think to save 500 billion a year, which I think would be a great accomplishment. Even that may be difficult without looking at some of these more mandatory spending programs. And so I actually honestly don't know what they're going to do, and I'm watching with great interest along with the rest of you.
Like no one here is gonna face the voters today.
It'll be if they restructure, yes, exactly. If they restructure entitlements, it'll protect everybody who's already in. It'll save for future retirees. And I think the country, listen, I've learned in my old age that if you lay out a problem, despite all the perceived divisions, if you lay out an issue and do it in an apolitical way, keep politics out of it, keep the ad hominems out of it, and just balance the issue, people, I would argue, are very receptive to solutions, even if it involves some pain. But you have to explain it to them in a bipartisan way, apolitical way. Yes, yes, sir, please.
First of all, for a great explanation of our economy, I think it was excellent. Here's my question. Artificial intelligence is becoming more and more ingrained in our systems. What do you see is the future implications on, first of all, productivity, which we assume would be there, but what about workforce? No.
So the artificial intelligence productivity boom actually has been going on for longer than people might. So for example, I would argue Google search, that's a version, early stage, rudimentary of artificial intelligence. What we're finding as technology increasingly disrupts jobs and disrupts people out of their jobs, we still seem to have plenty of jobs. I don't think people, the problem we're finding, and I think we're going to find even more, and then I'll get to AI and how it's going to work, I think, is you're going to have a lot more mismatches now. So I'm a driver of an automobile. I do it for a living. Driverless car is coming. I don't know what the time frame is, but in the next 10 years, I'm going to lose my job. If I work in a call center today, I make 55,000, 60 grand, I'm going to lose my job. What we're struggling with in this country is then taking that. So in the business that has the person leaving, they'll be more productive. Whether the economy will be more productive will depend on where that person, that 45-year-old person still needs to work. Where are they going to go? And what we're finding is we have not been great at taking that person, retraining them, and putting them in another job where they're highly productive. And then the economy really does gain. And so we've got all these, what I call mismatches. And remember, worker mobility in this country is historically low. I'm not going to travel 1,000 miles to take a certain type of job. First of all, I may have a house, have a mortgage. I'm not sure I can get a place to live. And so I would argue early childhood literacy. That's why I spent a lot of my time philanthropically on 0 to 5. Our kids read to 0 to 5, improving secondary education, skills training in junior colleges has never been more important. Here's where AI, I think, is going to work. There are a small number of companies who know exactly how to spend on AI and exactly which use cases are going to work. But there are not that many of them. For the rest of us, and I include my own firm, we know we have to do it. We're going to do it. It's probably going to lower margins in the short run. And we'll know 10 years from now or 5 years from now which use cases worked and which didn't. So I would say my prediction is overall, we look back 10 years from now, we're going to say, boy, AI just made an enormous improvement in our productivity. But businesses are going to have a hard time predicting exactly which one works. And the other thing you're going to see is you're going to have workers more likely than we were when I was coming out of school get disrupted. Either my firm is going to be disrupted out of existence or my job is going to be disrupted out of my existence. And I'm going to need more help than, say, we all did in getting retrained and into another job, particularly if I'm if I'm a high school graduate. Yeah.
This whole clip, this ability to have a workforce, is going to affect China very significantly.
Very significantly. Yes, already is. Yes.
We talk about China as being an adversary that we have a big issue with. Well, a lot of folks in the international community see that the economy itself would take China down all by itself. Is a true setting?
So China has got severe challenges. I think in the US, sometimes we look at China as this juggernaut. And in some ways they are, but they're extremely highly leveraged. They have a worse demographic labor force growth issue than we do. They're not the magnet for talent that we are. We have an enormous advantage unless we squander it, of being a magnet for talent all over the world. They're not that kind of magnet. And most of the demographic studies I see suggest that China population growth is going to trend lower. And so what does it mean? They're going to have to improve productivity. They're making investments all over the world in other locations. And I would argue over time, if China really struggles, indirectly is not good for us either. Global growth being lower, something like 50% of S&P 500 revenues come from outside the United States. So while China is on one category an adversary in certain things, a competitor in other things, I think we're gonna have to find ways to go to the third track, collaborate with them on other things too, because while we want world stability and we don't want undue power, I think seeing them deteriorate excessively probably ultimately is not in our interest either. And by the way, when we came out of the Great Recession, China was growing 6.5% a year. That actually helped us climb our way out of the Great Recession. So this is a hard thing to do. What part of our brain competitor, part of our brain adversary, part of our brain actually cooperate and integrate. And I think we're struggling with that right now, if that makes sense. Please.
Welcome to Tallahassee.
Good to be here.
Really glad you're here. So, I was reading the paper the other day and, your boss's name came up. And, Goldman had a really good year last year. And I was just, when my jaw dropped, I gasped at his $80 million bonus or handcuff, golden handcuff, if you will. But then I said, in entertainment and in sports, that's not that big a deal. The captains of American industry that are so important to us certainly deserve the best compensation of any. And I'm really appreciative of your remarks. Couple of takeaways that I have is that are important. I wonder if your boss and if Goldman is going to embrace these. And that's one, entitlements. Is Goldman and maybe the financial community at large, are they going to cooperate with DOGE to make some real recommendations on which entitlements? The great Huey Long said, don't cut you and don't cut me, let's get the other guy behind the tree. And, they're out there, and which ones are they going to be? And how are we going to go about that with our leaders of private industry stepping out there? We've got some from the tech, obviously, that are ready to go. Is Goldman ready to participate?
Yeah, so let me tell you a little secret. I taught leadership, for 10 years at Harvard.
Yep.
Left my job, to do this. And here's what I've learned about leaders. If you're in one of these jobs, the board will decide what you get paid, and you may get paid more than, but I mean, I know our CEO and I know lots of leaders like him. You don't get in that job and stay in that job unless you have a passion for what you do. This is my experience. And you're trying to make a positive difference in the world. So I think most of us, and I'll speak for myself, I think we want to see the world a better place. We'd like to use our firm as a way to improve the world, not just in our business, philanthropically. And so, yeah, if we can give advice that would forget who has helped and who's hurt, whether we're helping, that can make the US and the world better and the economies better, or local communities better, we're gonna do that. And I know these folks, I feel that way, and I know these guys personally, and I think you'll see that's sort of been the history of our firm. But you read these headlines that this one gets paid and this one, yeah, that's true. But I think you're going to see that you don't get in those positions or stand them if you don't try to make the world a better place. And so that's the challenge for us. Yes.
Crystal ball cost of money over the next few years.
Which crystal ball, which did
The interest rates, cost of money.
So here's what I think is going to happen, but the short answer is I don't know. It's the most intelligent answer, but let me tell you what I would guess. And there'll be scenarios around this. The most likely case is, let's assume that somehow we're able to get a grip on fiscal spending. Okay, to where not overnight, but over the years, we start to flatten the curve. And instead of running 6.5%, 7% of GDP deficits, we're on our way to 5% and lower than we've been. And let's assume that we don't, so therefore we don't have these big excess fiscal spending programs. We sort of calm that down and get to more normal fiscal spending. I do believe that over time, the Fed funds rate, so I'll talk about the short rates and I'll talk about longer rates. The Fed funds rate, in my opinion, is more likely to gravitate to in the neighborhood of 2 3/4 or 3%. I just don't know the timetable. And why do I say that? Inflation at 2%. And I think with this kind of economy, the real Fed funds rate, real after inflation, probably 0.75%. So, and I've done a lot of work on this. I would say we're gonna get there. What I don't know is whether they're gonna get there in 25 or, but we're eventually gonna get there. What I've been more confused about, where's the 10-year? If the short rate, if we show fiscal discipline, then I would be hopeful that we'll have kind of a more normal term premium between the Fed funds rate and the 10-year. What's that historically? I don't know, 150 basis points, could be a little bit more, a little bit less. So what's 150 plus 2 3/4? That's 4 1/4, 4.5. I would guess in the plus or minus mid 4s would not be crazy. Is it going to turn out the way I just said? I'm sure not. But I do think if we're able to get a better grip and a more organic economy, I think you'll have an upwardly sloped yield curve. My concern is if we don't get a grip on the fiscal side, you're going to see that back end be higher no matter what the front end is. And I don't think that's going to be a great thing. The only other change, which you didn't ask about, credit spreads. So for those of you who watch this, and we were talking before, credit spreads, what do I mean? That's what private business pays versus treasuries versus the risk-free rate. And it's super tight right now, super tight. I would guess that for good credits, it's going to stay super tight. But for weaker credits, I would guess the market's going to be more discerning in the years ahead with less government spending, more organic, and you may actually see spreads widen for weaker credits. In other words, there'll be more of a value to not being too leveraged if you're a business.
Please join me. Mr. Kaplan, on behalf of the Economic Hub of Florida, we've got a small token of our appreciation for this amazing conversation.
Thank you very much. Wow.
For the members, please watch your emails. We'll have announcements for our February and March programming soon. Stay warm, and we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.